Iran and Israel did not become enemies because they share a border, and they did not inherit this fight from some old colonial rivalry between the two of them. Their conflict grew out of a larger collapse in the Middle East, the rise of nationalism, the creation of Israel, the Iranian Revolution, and decades of war by proxy. What looks like a sudden confrontation is actually the result of layers of history piling up for more than a century. At the beginning of the 20th century, much of the Middle East was still part of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, that empire had ruled over a huge stretch of territory. But by the time World War I arrived, it was already weakening under military losses, internal strain, and pressure from European powers. When the Ottomans sided with Germany and lost the war, their empire fell apart. Britain and France stepped into the vacuum and began dividing former Ottoman lands into new political units, often drawing borders with little regard for the communities already living there. One of those territories was Palestine, placed under British control. It was home mainly to Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, with a smaller but growing Jewish population. During this same period, Zionism was gaining strength in Europe. The movement argued that Jewish people, after centuries of persecution, needed a homeland of their own. For many Zionists, that homeland was Palestine, tied to Jewish history, religion, and identity. Britain added fuel to an already difficult situation by making promises that pulled in different directions. It encouraged Arab hopes for independence during the war, while the Balfour Declaration signaled British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. As Jewish immigration increased in the 1920s and 1930s, especially as anti-Semitism and Nazi persecution intensified in Europe, tensions inside Palestine grew. Arab Palestinians feared that the land was being transformed against their will. Jewish communities, many shaped by trauma and insecurity, saw the need for safety and self-determination as urgent. Britain increasingly found itself unable to contain the conflict. After the Holocaust, international sympathy for a Jewish state rose sharply. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders accepted the plan in principle. Arab leaders rejected it, arguing it was unjust to the Arab majority already living there. In 1948, Israel declared independence. Neighboring Arab states invaded, and the First Arab-Israeli War began almost immediately. Israel survived and ended the war, holding more territory than the UN plan had assigned it. For Israelis, this became the story of independence and survival. For Palestinians, it became the Nakba, the catastrophe, marked by mass displacement, destroyed communities, and a refugee crisis that still shapes the region. Iran was not central to that first phase. It was not an Arab state, and it did not enter the conflict in the same way as Egypt, Jordan, Syria, or Iraq. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran actually maintained quiet but meaningful ties with Israel. Both countries saw advantages in cooperation. Israel was looking for non-Arab regional partners. Iran, under the Shah, was closely aligned with the United States and broadly oriented toward the West. For a time, Tehran and Tel Aviv had practical reasons to work together. But beneath Iran's outward stability, resentment was growing. A crucial turning point came in 1953. Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, challenging British control and alarming Western governments. A coup backed by the United States, and Britain removed him from power and strengthened the Shah. In Washington and London, this was treated as a strategic win. In Iran, it left a deep scar. Many Iranians saw it as proof that foreign powers would crush Iranian democracy to protect their own interests. The Shah remained in power for decades after that, presenting himself as a modernizer. He pushed industrialization, expanded ties with the West, and pursued social reforms. At the same time, his rule became increasingly repressive. His security apparatus cracked down on dissent, and many Iranians came to associate his government with corruption, authoritarianism, and dependence on the United States. That anger eventually exploded in 1979. The Iranian Revolution changed everything. The Shah fell, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile, and Iran became an Islamic republic built on a revolutionary ideology that rejected American influence and denounced Israel. The new leadership did not see Israel as just another state. It saw Israel as an illegitimate power backed by the West and implanted in what it viewed as Muslim land. Iran severed relations with Israel, handed Israel's former embassy to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and made opposition to Israel a central part of its regional identity. Later that same year, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took American diplomats hostage. The hostage crisis poisoned relations between Iran and the United States for generations. Because America was Israel's closest ally, Iran's hostility toward Washington and its hostility toward Israel became increasingly linked. After that, the rivalry was no longer just geopolitical. It was ideological, revolutionary, and deeply tied to how Iran defined itself. Then came the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, a devastating conflict that killed enormous numbers of people and reinforced Tehran's sense of isolation. Iran's leaders came away with several lasting lessons. They believed Iran could not rely on outside powers for security. They believed deterrence mattered, and they believed indirect warfare could help them challenge stronger enemies. That is where Iran's regional proxy strategy became central. In Lebanon, Iran supported the rise of Hezbollah, a powerful Shia movement and militia that defined resistance to Israel as one of its core missions. Over time, Iran also built relationships with armed groups and allied networks in Iraq, Syria, Gaza, and later Yemen. This gave Tehran a way to pressure Israel without fighting a conventional war from Iranian territory. Instead of one front, Iran helped create a web of fronts. Israel responded with its own long game. It treated Iran's expanding influence as a strategic threat, especially as Hezbollah grew stronger in Lebanon and Iran deepened its presence in Syria. At the same time, Iran's nuclear program became a major flashpoint. Tehran insisted its program was peaceful. Israel and many Western governments feared it could eventually give Iran a path to nuclear weapons. For Israeli leaders, that possibility was unacceptable. Over the years, this produced sabotage, cyber operations, assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, and repeated efforts to slow Iran's progress without triggering full-scale war. In 2015, the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA briefly created a diplomatic opening. Iran agreed to limits and monitoring in exchange for sanctions relief. Supporters argued it reduced the immediate nuclear risk. Critics, including Israel's government, argued it was too narrow and only postponed the problem. When the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018, the deal began to unravel. Iran gradually moved away from its own commitments, and the confrontation returned with even greater mistrust. For years, most of the conflict stayed in the shadows. Israel carried out strikes on Iranian-linked targets in Syria. Iran armed and financed partners across the region. Cyber attacks, covert missions, assassinations, and maritime incidents became part of a constant low-level war. The strange thing was that both sides seemed to understand the rules. They were enemies, but they were also trying to avoid a direct, all-out clash. That old logic started breaking down after October 7, 2023, when Hamas carried out a massive attack on Israel, killing around 1,200 people and taking hostages. Israel launched a huge military campaign in Gaza. The scale of destruction and loss of life that followed intensified anger across the region. Iran-backed groups became more active, and the risk of regional escalation rose sharply. The conflict was no longer confined to Gaza. It began radiating outward through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Red Sea, and eventually the Iran-Israel confrontation itself. In April 2024, an Israeli strike hit Iran's consular building in Damascus, killing senior Iranian officers. Iran responded with its first direct attack on Israel from Iranian territory, launching a large barrage of drones and missiles. Most were intercepted, but the significance was political as much as military. A boundary had been crossed. This was no longer only a proxy war. Later, in 2024, another round of direct exchanges followed. Hezbollah suffered major blows in Lebanon, including attacks that exposed Syria's security failures and the killing of its longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah in an Israeli strike. Iran then launched another missile attack on Israel, presenting it as retaliation for Israeli actions against Iranian and allied leaders. Israel struck back inside Iran. By that point, the old pattern of indirect conflict had clearly weakened. What had once been managed through deniability was becoming more open and more dangerous. This is why the Iran-Israel conflict matters, far beyond the two countries themselves. It sits at the intersection of the Palestinian question, the legacy of empire, the trauma of revolution, the rivalry between Iran and the United States, the balance of power in Lebanon and Syria, and the fear of nuclear escalation. It is also a conflict shaped by competing national memories. Israelis often frame the struggle through survival, deterrence, and the threat posed by an openly hostile Iranian state. Iranians frame it through revolution, resistance, anti-Western grievance, and opposition to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Palestinians, meanwhile, have lived with the consequences of regional power struggles for generations, often as the people paying the highest price. What makes this conflict especially volatile is that both sides believe they are acting defensively, and both believe the other side is trying to reshape the region by force. That creates a cycle in which every strike is presented as a response, every escalation is justified as deterrence, and every new red line becomes easier to cross than the last.